So here's an interesting paradox related to the problem of development, and that is the situation of the two selves. For the very moment we start even considering developing ourselves, we conjure the image of the aspirational self, the self that we long to develop into. And so it forces us to consider two different versions of ourselves, the self we are now and the self that we long to become. And this means that even the mere thought of development gives rise to a fracture within us, a fracture between these two selves, these two versions of ourselves. And the interesting question is, which one of these selves is really the one driving us to develop? Is it our present self, or is it somehow our aspired to self calling us forth from the future somehow? Let's reflect on this a little bit and see if we can come up with some sophisticated responses to this weird situation. One of the first and most important things to understand about these two selves is they are in a form of conflict with each other, meaning that the present self intuits, feels, senses that in order for the aspirational self, the aspired to self, to become real, for us to become a developed version of ourselves, we're going to have to let go of our present self, which means that there is a death and rebirth happening here. And obviously, as we've talked about before, this death and rebirth process is experienced as a threat for the present ego, which is to say we're facing another wall of fire. In short, the present self has to die in order for us to become our aspirational self, and our present self doesn't have a death wish. And that poses a challenge for us. And this challenge doesn't get any easier in lieu of the fact that the very idea of developing ourselves implies a dissatisfaction with who we are now. And this plays into this whole image of the internal fracture, right? Because which part of us is saying or thinking or feeling that it is not satisfied with who we are now? Like that implicitly has to be a part of us that is somehow beyond who we are now, right? A part which is able to look beyond our present perceptome, our present self-perception, which is not an uninteresting idea to play with. That some part of us already is ahead of us somehow. But nevertheless, we're caught in this problem, right? How do we step into this higher self? How do we develop into the aspired to self from the place that we are now, if the self we are now does not want to make that leap, because it means it is gonna have to die in order for something higher, something more grand, something more developed to be rebirthed out of the ashes. And step number one is, of course, to get a kind of an image or an idea of the gulf that we're trying to cross, right? And we do that by describing precisely the attributes of the aspired to self. Just so we can start to get an idea of the gulf between the one we are now and the one we're trying to become. So that's step number one, describe the aspired to self. Step number two. Once we've described these attributes, the next step is really to feel into the rightness of these attributes, feel into the resonance within us with these attributes, in order to some degree discover that we are partially there already, right? That there are aspects of the values of the aspired to self that we find attractive and that we want to integrate into our own personality, our own lives, our own ways of being in the world, of relating to the world and the people around us. And by feeling this inner resonance with this higher self that we are not yet, we start to approach it from a position of the heart, basically. We start to recognize that something within us is already in a profound relation with these higher values, because we feel that resonance. And that breaks this illusion that the higher self is something foreign from us, that the higher self is something strange that we're trying to step into, which is not really us. It is kind of really us, right? Because if it wasn't considering and contemplating the values and the attitudes of this higher self, wouldn't resonate with us. And this resonance in our hearts with these higher values is really is a really important experience to have, because it proves to us that it is already inside us somehow, or at least that there is already something inside of us that is in some kind of communication or connection with this aspired to self. And that helps us to close the gulf between our present self and the aspired to self. And this brings us to step number 3. The interesting realization that the fact that we feel this resonance proves to us that the gulf between who we are now and the aspired to self is not as big as we think, right? This resonance proves that the aspired to self already lives within us to some extent. And that should give us confidence, that should give us belief in the possibility of attaining this higher self, or of stepping into this higher version of ourselves. Because there is already this resonance in our hearts with this higher version of ourselves, which means it's not as foreign as we think. It is already somewhere in here. Step number 4, and this is important because, as the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke points out in his video series about the meaning crisis, he says, you cannot reason yourself into a higher version of yourself. This is not merely a game of thinking. Stepping into a higher version of ourselves is not a propositional, logical, cognitive act. It is a much deeper process, which is much more intimately connected to the faculty of feeling rather than that of thinking. And the final step, of course, is the integration. And this is something that I'm amazed that we're not talking more about in our culture. Because it is a foundational question. How do we step into a higher version of ourselves if we don't only think our way there? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. We act it out. That is how you become a higher version of yourself, by acting out a different, higher version of yourself. Which is why it's so important to understand the attributes and the values of this aspired to self that we long to become. Because if we don't do that, we have no idea what kinds of actions it would take in certain situations. And the interesting thing about action is that through action, a reification happens. Which is to say, we might sit with all our inner experiences of, yeah, I want to be this higher version of myself and it has these values and that's all great. But if you're not acting it out in the world, it's merely a form of logically, cognitively based masturbation, right? We're thinking about it, we're imagining it, but we're not being it concretely in the world. And so the most effective way of becoming anything other than we are, the most effective way of developing, is really related to the doing. To know what the higher version of ourselves would do, what are the more sophisticated manners and modes of action that the higher self bases its own being in the world upon, and then acting out that. Like once we act that out, we can no longer claim to be our old self, because now we have changed our being in the world. Now, obviously, in the beginning, these actions might be constituted in thinking. We might be deciding to do something because that is what our higher self would do, not so much because that is what feels natural to us. But over time, obviously we will entrain ourselves. It's like spiritual development in the end is not that different from all other kinds of development. What do you do in school? What do you do in athletics? What do you do in any field that you want to get better? You train, and what do you train? You train through action. We try to hone our way of being in the world such that it becomes closer to that of the higher self which we aspire to become. And so basically, what we have to do is find out, what would my higher self do in this situation? What would Jesus do in this situation? And then doing that. And then feeling the rightness of these more sophisticated modes of action. Because feeling the rightness, feeling the resonance with these modes of actions is what is going to help it become integrated into our hearts. So it's no longer just a forced action, but it becomes a naturally from the inside motivated action in the world. If we could all just do that, well,